All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back for another Bible study, 2 Samuel. We're going to do chapters 8 and 9 today. They're again a couple shorter chapters. We'll do 8 and 9, so that's where we'll be reading today. We'll go ahead, just do a really quick recap. I think most of the people are familiar with what we're doing here, maybe some people that aren't as frequent. But here's the book Bible study. We're doing God's Word as one story through one family. So in this Bible study, rather than slowing down on a verse or two, we're going through chapter by chapter, almost like story-esque. And there's obviously still a lot to learn in there, but we're going through and showing how the Bible is one long story. They seem disjointed when you jump into a book and just start reading it out of there, but it's all connected. It's all about Jesus' family. And it's really all about Jesus, right? And this is the bloodline that Messiah would come through. We found out they're not even any more special than anybody else, other than they were chosen to have the Messiah birthed through them. Israel still sins, just like all the Gentile nations. Jumping into our review again, 2 Samuel 2 we'll just start at. Just very quickly, remember David had now been anointed king of Judah after Saul and Jonathan died, but only that one tribe, right? He was only king over that one tribe, even though God said he'd be king over all of them. So we just had to trust, and we learned that God's kingdom comes in a process, right? Even Jesus did. Then Ishbosheth was made king of Israel, but remember, he's a weak leader. He was propped up by Abner. Abner was the commander of Saul's army. He's just trying not to lose a job, basically, right? And he's trying to keep power. Nobody wants to lose power when they have it. That's how it goes in politics. This is politics, essentially. And Ishbosheth's made king. He's a propped up king. Then, of course, there's the Battle of Gibeon where the war started. Right out the gate, there was 24 deaths. 12 died from each side, showing how futile and stupid this war would be, especially when God promised what would happen. Asahel ends up dying because he takes things into his own hands, even though he was going after Abner, which seemed to be the enemy. It was not God's way. And Asahel ends up dying with the spear through his stomach there. Then, of course, Abner, we learned, joined David, right? A lot of betrayal, and there's not really a lot of loyalty except loyalty to themselves, right? People are loyal to themselves, and you see that here with Abner. Abner just wants power, and Ishbosheth is getting a little jealous because Abner has so much power. He accused him of sleeping with Rizpah, which was a concubine of Saul's, which really was a threat to the throne, it looked like, if he had done it. But we think it was a false accusation that Ishbosheth's just getting worried and trying to find a way to get rid of Abner because he's starting to gain power. Abner gets so mad, he decides to join David and tell all of Israel to join David. And then when Abner joined his side, Joab was so mad, remember, because he killed Abishai and Joab's brother. We just learned about Asahel. So Joab and Abishai, too. Abishai was with him. Joab's the leader of it all, it seems. Takes him outside of the city because it was a city of refuge. So then he could legally kill him outside of the city, not in the city. So he takes him out and he killed him and murdered him. And David was not happy about that because David, although it was his enemy, said, we're not going to do it like this. I don't want this treachery. I don't want murders and backstabbing happening in my kingdom, right? Then chapter 4, we saw more loyalty switches. The two leaders of Ishbosheth's army, once Abner died, they knew Ishbosheth was weak. They decided, you know what, we'll do the same kind of thing. We'll try to get in David's good side. We'll kill Ishbosheth. They killed him in his sleep, chopped his head off, brought it to David. And David said, what are you guys doing? The last time that somebody brought me something from a dead king, I killed him. It was an Amalekite. And so he has them both killed as well, right? And then we got a little snapshot, which is going to be useful today, of Mephibosheth, was one of Jonathan's sons. And the nurse, when they found out that Jonathan and Saul were dead, they fled because, they're not going to be safe from David. And also the Philistines could also attack him. It just wasn't safe. So she fled and ran, and in her haste, dropped him, and he became injured, crippled in his legs, we learned. Then in chapter 5, David was finally anointed king over all of Israel. It was finally a united kingdom now, right? He was united all the 12 tribes, just as God had promised. It was such a process, about 2 decades long, a little under maybe, but it finally came to be. And then, of course, right in line, David then moves from Hebron to Jerusalem, takes Jerusalem. The Jebusites had Jerusalem, takes that, makes it the capital. It's a more centralized location now, right? So it shows that all of Israel is united, and it's not only going to be their political capital, it's also going to be their worship capital, we'll find out. King Hiram finds out, so David becomes an international king. People start to become very well aware of him. King Hiram wants to build him a house, which is pretty cool, and that's what happens there. And then the Lord defeated the Philistines. The Philistines decided to attack. I'm sure they felt betrayed by David, because remember, David was on their side for a little bit, even though he shouldn't have been. But when he went away to Gath and all that stuff. So the Philistines attacked him. David prayed to God. God defeated them. Then the Philistines attacked again. David prayed. God said, do it a different way this time. Go behind them, and you'll hear the trees in the air. That's my army attacking. Follow me then. And that's what happened. And David defeated the Philistines with the Lord's help. It shows that the Lord wins all of our battles. And then chapter 6, the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Jerusalem. They screwed up at first, remember? They brought it on a cart. They shouldn't have done that. They can't use new technology to make things easier. You got to do it God's way. And they were celebrating, but of course Uzzah died when it started to shift, and he put his hand out on the Ark of the Covenant, and we know from Numbers, the book of Numbers, you can't touch the Ark either. So they were supposed to carry it with poles, and they're not supposed to touch it. They broke 2 of God's commandments, basically, is what had happened there, and that's why people are dying. David was confused at first, which shows that he was unfamiliar with the rules and regulations of God's word, which is really interesting. He was confused and angry about it. And then if you read in 2 Chronicles, he figured it out because he said, oh, we got to actually carry it on poles, and we need the Kohathites to do this. We did it wrong, guys. That's why it happened. And then, of course, they actually bring the covenant. Once he finds out that it's giving blessing, right? He's giving blessing. David says, okay, it wasn't the ark that was the problem. I read all my stuff. We got to go get the ark. And they bring it into Jerusalem, and they're cheering, and David is dancing. And the Michal's all mad that he's dancing and says he exposed himself. But he was wearing a long robe, and we don't think from how the story ended that David actually did it, that Michal's maybe jealous, and she's upset. And remember, Michal is kind of one of those Christians who's very judgmental and thinks her way is the best way to worship, and you can't dance because she accuses David of doing something a king should never do. So my dad Saul would have never acted like this. This is not how a king acts. He shouldn't be doing all this stuff. And David says, well, I'll do it. If it's for the Lord, I'll do whatever I want. I'll dance. I don't care how embarrassed you are. I'll do it, right? And then it said that Michal could never have a son after that. That's why you know that David probably didn't expose himself. David's done a lot of bad things in the Bible, but I don't think he actually exposed himself there. I think it was a whole issue there with Michal's heart because she's no longer able to have kids after that. And then we learned about last week, of course, the Davidic covenant. This is where the Lord, remember David wanted to build a house for the Lord, wanted to build him a temple, and God said, I never asked for a temple all these years with the judges and from Moses on. I never asked for one. I don't need one. Instead, as a matter of fact, I'm going to build you a house, right? Which sounds strange just because he already had a house, right? But this is a deeper house, right? It's kind of how we've been talking about the house of Saul, the family. He says he's going to bless his family, and the Messiah is basically going to come through that there, and he will reign forever and ever. And God gives him, that's how he gives David's house, builds his house for him. And then, of course, David prayed a prayer of gratitude. And what I loved about this prayer, you can just kind of glaze over it and just say, oh, it's a cool little prayer or whatever. But when you see that David he says that he's bold enough to pray this prayer because of what God told him. So, which is really interesting. It means that promises of God are really important for us to remember. It gives us boldness to pray because sometimes you can pray and be like, oh, I don't know if God's even going to do this, but I'll pray it. But if you remember God's promises, you can pray a lot bolder, and that's what David is showing us right here. He said he only prayed for his house to be forever because God promised it. So he had the boldness to pray for this then, and he was thankful to the Lord. And that was that. Now we're going to go ahead and enter into chapters 8 and 9, first with David's victories, and then we'll see David's kindness to Mephibosheth. So 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1. All right. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Metheg-Ammah out of the hand of the Philistines. And he defeated Moab, and he measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. And David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. And David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toi sent his son Joram to King David to ask about his health and to bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi. And Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he had dedicated from all the nations he subdued, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David made a name for himself when he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt. Then he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons. And all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel, And David administered justice and equity to all his people. Joab the son of Zeruiah was over the army, and Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was recorder, and Zadok the son of Ahitub and Ahimelech the son of Abiathar were priests, and Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lodabar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons, and Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both feet. All right, so a lot happens there in chapters 8 and 9. First off, it starts with David's victories, and we learn about his administration. So now that he's king and established, we're going to see that he's making peace. Why it goes right back into these victories and these wars is just showing that his stability is growing. They're extending their borders. The borders are continuing to grow. Under King David, they're getting more land, and they're at peace with their enemies in all directions. So let's look at the first verse here. It says, "After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Metheg-Ammah out of the hand of the Philistines." First thing to understand there, just really quick, Metheg-Ammah is another name for Gath, basically. So in the Bible, it's really tricky. I've talked about before. Is it Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai? It's both of them. Two different names, right? Just like Jacob or Israel. It's the same guy, two different names. Same thing here. So what's interesting is it starts right out in the victories that David takes Gath. And remember, we've been reading about Gath since 1 Samuel, right? Remember when David ran from Saul and he ran to Gath and pretended to be crazy in front of King Achish? And then he left, and then when Saul chased him again, he went and ended up living in Gath. Or not living in Gath, went to Gath, lived down south in his land of Ziklag, or his town of Ziklag, but he was hanging out in Gath. That's where King Achish was. So now he actually goes and takes it, we believe. He goes into the Philistines, actually takes their land. But remember, they attacked him twice. We just read about it. They attacked twice, and God defeated them. So now David says, all right, we're going on the offensive. And they actually go, we're being Gaza today, actually, right? There's a lot of war been going on for thousands of years there. And David took Gath there, right? That's what's going on there. Now you go to verse 2, and it talks about how he defeated Moab, and it's a really interesting situation here. Oh, man. It's where he lies them down, basically 3 guys at a time, kills 2 of them in each line. He kills 2 lines, saves 1 of them. Basically what's going on here is he's obviously going to wipe them out, limit their army here, but he's keeping that one set. One, the reason they would do this, one, to pay tribute, basically tax them, so it's financial gain for the economy. But another thing was all these people, like, imagine how terrifying it would be. You get lined up. It's awful. Things have happened like this in the history before. And you see all your friends get shot and killed. You're going to go and tell everybody how terrifying this was and how powerful David is. So he keeps them around to let them know, how his power is and let people know about it, but also that they'll be able to pay taxes. And he still keeps the Moabites there. And he might not wipe them out because turn back. Now he's upset, but remember his great-grandmother Ruth is a Moabite. Turn back to 1 Samuel 22. Go back to the last book, right before this one, 1 Samuel 22, and we're going to go to verses 3 and 4. Remember, Ruth was from Moab, and that's where they left in the book of Ruth, if you remember. So it's kind of his family, but he does defeat them. But look what happens in 1 Samuel 22, verses 3 and 4. 1 Samuel 22, verses 3 and 4. Here it is. And David went there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me. And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. So remember, this is also where David took his parents. So the question is, why is David killing the Moabites like this? Some people think it could be something happened to his parents. We don't ever find out what happened to Jesse and his wife. We never hear about that. There's a potential. We don't know. There's a potential he was out of fury, so mad that he actually went and killed the Moabite because he seemed to be friendly with him in 1 Samuel 22. He's taken his parents there. So perhaps something happened to Jesse and his wife, David's mom, that he said, that's enough. You didn't take care of my parents. I'm going to wipe you guys out and only leave a few. We're not sure. But he does take the Moabites. And what's really interesting, again, is not only did he take his parents there, but that's also part of his relatives. So it's part of his family he's actually gone to take care of. So that's why we think something might have happened there, but we're not necessarily positive. Then we see verses 3 and 4. David also defeated Hadadezer, who was a king of Zobah. Now, Zobah was up north. It was a northern kingdom, basically above them, like basically where modern-day Syria is. So there's Syria and Zobah. And it says that Hadadezer was going down to the Euphrates, which that ties in with a promise, back in the beginning to Abraham with all the land. But you can see the Euphrates there. He's going down there, and David wipes them out, right? So he hamstrung, although he kills a bunch of men, 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrings all of the chariot horses. This is a really interesting thing, like when these kind of things happen in the Bible. Why would David hamstring all of these horses, right? Well, a couple things. One, you can't take care of all these horses. There'd be so many horses, right, to take care of. Plus, if you allowed horses, the army could regroup. They got more military people. They could regroup and jump on these horses. So he only kept, I think it said 100, enough for 100 chariots, but he hamstrung them. Basically what it does is makes them lame. Literally cuts them so they can't walk right? So they're not a threat. He doesn't kill them. He just basically cripples them. Still not a nice thought about horses, but that's why he would have done it. And also, it's also showing, what's awesome is I love when the Bible ties into these biblical things here. Psalm 20, verse 7, I'll just read it for you. You'll recognize this one. Psalm 20, verse 7. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. So he could have actually strengthened his army and just said, you know what, I got more people I can train back in Israel. We'll just keep taking and taking and taking. But he doesn't do that. It also said, David also obeys, I put in here Deuteronomy 17, verse 15 and 16. God talks about their kings one day. This is what he says. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not be a foreigner, put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. And then listen to this. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. So whether David knew this or not, he's actually following, you're not supposed to gather all these horses, because what it is, you'll start to put your faith in your army, right? And you'll find out all the downfall of Israel every time, which is why I always get worried for the United States, is that they got so caught up in their power and wealth. They had a strong army and a really good economy. And then what happens is you start to trust in your military and your economy. Israel will do that. That they had a strong army and they had a good economy, and that's how they're defeating people. It was really the Lord. So then the Lord takes that stuff away. So David here, being very wise, hamstrings the horses, not going to get greedy, and he's also not going to let them come back. That's why he does that. It's a really weird detail, but when you understand that, it makes more sense. Now look at verses 5 through 8 there. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down the 22,000 men. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And it talks about even how in his cities he got bronze. First off, garrisons. We don't really use that term a lot anymore, but unless you're in the military, you'll understand. But it's groups of military troops, right? So he puts garrisons. He conquers them in Aram up north, and then he puts troops in there, right? This would be like if we conquered Canada. We had a war with Canada, and we defeated them. And then afterwards, we sent the United States military up there, and we had some troops up there monitoring, right? That is so, we know we do this other places too. That's so they can't rise up again and overtake you, and you kind of keep them in check. And you can also take their taxes. You can actually tax them too. So it's basically an extension of government and military power to keep them in check. So you can see he's actually putting military troops up there now, which ensured control and prevented the rebellion of the people. And then, of course, again, they make them pay tax or tribute. That happens a lot when you conquer a people. You'd allow them to live, but they'd have to pay you taxes. So all this time you're seeing that he's getting this gold, this silver, these taxes. You can see this military is growing and the economy is growing. This whole chapter is to show that under David's kingdom, the Lord is blessing them. Again, great wealth and prosperity. You're seeing it happen. That's why it's saying all these things here. But the key phrase is, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And by his actions, he's noticing that. He hamstrung those horses. He knows the Lord's the one doing this. He's been doing it his whole life, basically. So this is just divine blessing and fulfillment of God's covenant. Remember, God made this covenant. So after chapter 7, we read about God's going to bless his house. And now we're seeing all of this blessing come to be. All right, verses 9 and 10. When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toi sent his son Joram to King David to ask about his health and to bless him. It's a really cool thing here, this other king does. So we learned about King Hiram, who helped David build a house. Now you're hearing about this other king sending his son there to talk to David. Because why? Well, it says that he killed his arch nemesis, right? He killed his enemy. Hadadezer had been going to war with Hamath forever, and King Toi was sick of it. And he finds out, wow, David killed my enemy. This is great. So that's why he's like, he sends his son, check on his health, check on how he's doing, basically to make peace, and also essentially submitting to David, seeing that David's ruling, and basically submitting him that was a good thing, recognizing David as a strong and godly king who took out his enemy. Now, this is really interesting because we have to remember this, even as the church. So Israel, we have to know that not all of Israel's surrounding neighbors were enemies to the Lord. We think a lot that everybody in Canaan was an enemy to Yahweh, and they all had their multiple gods. They did. A lot of them did. Most of the time they did. However, you'd have these kind of situations where Toi would come and say, hey, this is a blessing. You guys are great. We're on your side. We're going to be friends with you. They're not necessarily followers of Yahweh, right? So it goes to show you that you can't treat, even in the church, just because somebody doesn't go to church all the time and doesn't read their Bible, doesn't mean they're hostile to God. Doesn't mean they're hostile to things, right? And, I'd like to think that David offered to Toi, like, hey, well, I'm only successful because of Yahweh and my Lord, and you need to learn about him. I would have loved to think that that's what they did with Toi, but it is an essential thing for us to know that not all non-believers are hostile to God, right? And we can remember this. Just like Toi was from another country, not all non-believers will be hostile to God either just because they don't believe, and there's a way you can maybe make an impact there. But again, we're seeing Israel's growing wealth continue through the conquest, and now even international nations again are recognizing him and even partnering with him. Verse 11, these also King David dedicated to the Lord together with the silver and the gold that he dedicated from all the nations he subdued. So David knows these, you can call them trophies. These are basically trophies. These trophies are God's, and God won the battle. So you can see here, this is really, just in this one verse, that's why I love, you can look at verses, you can read them and gloss right over it. But in that verse, you can learn something right there. That, look at, man tries to praise David. They bring him all this gold and the silver, they try to praise him. And what has he done with it? He gives it right to the Lord. He gives it right to the God. So basically see this as they come to praise David, and David takes all the praises and passes them right on to the Lord and says, well, yeah, this is all God's anyway, so I'm going to take the silver and the gold, whatever, it's his. This ain't mine. I know you're giving it to me, but this isn't mine. I didn't earn this. God earned it. And that's why all those things are going to God, because man gives praise to David, but David gives praise to God, and he points them in the right direction, which is pretty good. Chapter 12, it says, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, Philistines, Amalek. You're probably wondering, why are all those names in there? Basically, that's just saying the north, the east, the south, the west, right? Because Edom is down in the south, if you remember. And remember, Edom is Esau's family. So there's a whole interesting war going on there with Israel and Edom, basically forever and ever. Moab, the Ammonites. Moab's on the east. The Philistines are on the west. And then Zobah, remember, up north. So basically what we're seeing here is God led Israel to victory over neighbors in every direction. They're dominating no matter which way you turn. They have full control over everything. And by the way, Israel controlled more land here with David than in any other time in history. That's why there's a good sign of what the Lord would do. But then, of course, it regresses and goes down later. But we're seeing some of the greatest strength and prosperity in Israel there. All right, let's go down to verses 13 and 14 now, this chapter. And David made a name for himself when he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites. Then he put garrisons in Edom. So he does the same thing there with Edom. So he went up north, remember, he had troops there. Now he's deploying troops down south to where Edom is at. And again, the Lord is the one giving him all this victory. It says again, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And I love that. When you read a chapter and you see a phrase repeated over and over again, it just means it's very important and you should really pay attention to it. The Bible doesn't waste God doesn't waste his breath or waste any ink in the Bibles there. The Lord's the one giving him the victory. Then verse 15 says that David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. So not only did he rule and dominate, some kings back then were evil and ruled with terror, right? And dominated that way. David does not. David shows us he's the true sign of the coming Jesus Christ, the coming Messiah. He is carrying this out to show us what the good Lord will really do when he leads. Not only is he reigning, but he's administering justice and equity. There will be complete justice when Jesus rules, right? So back then it was very just. There was a lot of justice. Everything was kept right, and he was running it in a righteous and a godly way, which is why it's being blessed. And again, it's pointing to Christ, really. And then verses 16 through 18, I won't go through and read all the names like I did before, but basically we're seeing, there's Joab, we've been reading about him, but then it lists all these other administrators. Basically, it's his government cabinet. It's basically all the people around him, right? And this shows a couple things, that a great leader has a solid team of leaders around them. If you want to run a country successfully or a kingdom successfully, you have to have good leaders around you because the job's too big for one great leader. So it shows you all these things. Because remember, King Saul never had a list of government officials. You never read, and then King Saul's treasurer was this and his secretary. You don't read all that because Saul probably didn't operate like that. And his kingdom was not operating as smoothly as David's did. It's showing that David had really able men who were able to help him out. And he knew he needed to raise and train strong administrators. So it also shows that David was able to train strong administration as well. And then the only other thing I'll mention in those verses there is the Kerethites and the Pelethites. That's really interesting there. They're basically foreign mercenaries from Crete, we believe. It's really interesting that David got foreign mercenaries basically to come in and protect him. They were loyal to David. So they were his bodyguards. The question would be, why not Israel? Why didn't anybody from Israel? Some people think it's because some would argue over who was more important. You know what I mean? It would just be like anything like, all right, which tribe gets to, all right, the tribe of Dan, come over, I'll get bodyguards for you. And then the tribe of Dan's like, look at us, we get to be with the king. So it's prevented arguments, right? From who is going to get who. He's going to get outside help from Crete, from the Kerethites and the Pelethites. And he does put one of his guys in charge of them. Look at Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over them. So there's still one of his administrators over them, but he had foreign mercenaries, which is really interesting there. Now let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 9, which is one of the most amazing gospel chapters in the entire Old Testament, probably. Verse 1. Now first, we're going to see it shift again from military victory. Now it's all this power and strength to compassion and generosity, right? This is the Lord. The Lord, this is how it's all going to end, by the way. The Lord's going to come back like a warrior king and dominate, set the earth right, set the world right, and show compassion and generosity to all those who believed in him and rule righteously, right? So that's what we're seeing from the war to now peace and kindness. Verse 1. And David said, is there still anyone left in the house of Saul that I might show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? So remember last chapter, David asked, in chapter 7, it'll be 2 chapters ago, David asked, what can he do for God? God, can I build you a house? Now he's saying, what can I do for others? What can I do for Jonathan? What's cool is David is showing a godly heart. How can I love God and love my neighbor? Isn't that what Jesus said? I'll love God by I'll build you a house. God's like, no, I don't need one. It's like, well, how can I help Jonathan? How can I help my neighbor? So he goes and asks, and it's showing that he's thinking about other people, thinking about God and others and how he can bless them. He could have said, I'm a rich king, I'm powerful, I'm successful, I can just kind of sit back and enjoy this now because there's peace. But he didn't. And he's showing us how we should be, right? Always looking to help others. Now, what's interesting is Jonathan had been dead for years now, right? 4 years, probably over a decade at this point. And David could have forgot about him. Sometimes we do like, I promised to do that, but it's been like 10 years now. I forgot. I don't even know if there's anybody around. I don't know what I can do, right? But he reflected on his promises, and even though his promises are late, and even though it looks late, because David probably could have right afterwards said, where's Jonathan's people, right? Even though it was late, David still keeps up with his promise, because remember, he made that covenant back in 1 Samuel 20 with Jonathan. He made him a promise that he'd take care of his family. So that's what David's going to do. And again, this goes against cultural norms. David is supposed to kill everybody from Jonathan's family because they're rightful heirs to Saul's throne. So that's really interesting there. Now look at verses 2 and 3. It says, now there was a servant of the house, his name Ziba, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? He says, I'm your servant. Is there still someone in the house of Saul that I may show kindness to? And Ziba says, there is actually a son, but he's crippled in his feet. So right here, the fact that David had to ask around means Mephibosheth is hard to find. Why is he hard to find? Well, he's in exile. He's in hiding, probably because so he doesn't get killed, because that's what happens. When you're the king's son or grandson, you're going to get wiped out. So he's hiding out in exile. The fact that he has to ask for him shows that he's hiding out. Verse 4, the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodabar. So he says, hey, I know right where he's at. He's across the Jordan River. By the way, it's across the river. So he's trying to get on the other side, get out of town. So he's not even, paying attention. And he's staying in Lodabar. Lodabar means no pasture or no thing. Literally in the middle, we would say he's in the middle of nowhere. He lives at Machir's house out in the middle of nowhere, right? In Jabip, or whatever you want to call it, right? Whatever you call it, whatever you say, is he basically is out there. You're not going to find there's nothing going on there, right? And it makes sense if he was hiding out. He'd be hiding in the middle of nowhere. And that's what Lodabar really was. Verses 5 and 6, King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, came to David, fell on his face, which is it's amazing here. It says, behold, I am your servant. So Mephibosheth was no longer hidden from David, and he was also probably terrified. Although David said, hey, I'm going to do all these great things to you, he probably said, yeah, right, you're going to kill me, right? You're going to kill me. So he's probably kind of scared, but even crippled, and I love in this picture here, I got his crutches laying down there. Even crippled, he's going to get down for the Lord, or down for David, right? To show that he's honoring him, right? And I love how this all starts here too in verse 6. If you see, it says, and David said, Mephibosheth. That's like exclamation point of mine. And he answered, behold, I am your servant. So David calls him by name. Again, isn't that Christ-like? He calls us by name. Isaiah 43:1, here's what it says. But now thus says the Lord, he created you, O Jacob. He who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. So you're seeing Christ-likeness here. Not only is he going to save Mephibosheth, he's going to call him by name. He's approaching him and calling him out first before Mephibosheth can come and say anything. He's calling him by name, and I thought that was really neat in those verses as well. Now down to verses 7 and 8. We're making our way down to the end here. You see here, do not fear, I'll show kindness, sake of your father Jonathan, restore all your land. And he says, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? So basically, Mephibosheth is getting all of his grandfather's land back, all things that were lost. He's getting back. Ishbosheth lost him in the war, and now it's getting returned. Just like us, all the things, are the perfection, all the things that were lost, the glorious earth when it was first created without sin, that will be returned. The creation and everything will be restored, including our bodies, right? So it's kind of, you can see that restoration process there. And that David, again, is honoring Mephibosheth as a friend of the king rather than an enemy. It's absolutely amazing. And that's why Mephibosheth can't understand this. Like, I'm supposed to be an enemy. You're supposed to be killing me. Not only that, I'm crippled. Like, why are you being so nice to me? And I love that he says he's worthless and insignificant. The dead dog is, I'm worthless and insignificant. What are you doing? And this is like us to the Lord. Lord, why did you save us? Why did you open my eyes and not my neighbors down the road? Why is he still an atheist? Why am I not? Why did you make me understand all this stuff, right? That's how we should act. Like, why do we deserve it? We don't do anything on our own to deserve this. It's just out of the grace and kindness of God's heart. And it's the same here. Verses 9 and 10, you read that Mephibosheth now gets servants, right? He's going to get those servants. Ziba's family is going to work the land, which is good for Ziba's family, by the way. That's jobs. He had a big family and a lot of servants. So they're making out in the deal. And actually, we're going to find out later on, I think it's chapter 16, Ziba's not the greatest. And just like a lot of other characters in these chapters, Ziba's going to look out for himself, right? But Ziba's like, yeah, we'll take care of him. And his 15 sons and 20 servants. It's going to be a large staff. They're going to take care of all the land. They get good jobs, and Mephibosheth gets servants, right? Verse 11, Mephibosheth's now like one of the king's sons. You can see, according to all that my lord commands his servant, so will your servant do. And Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons, just like us. We'll get invited to the table, right? Revelation 19 talks about the marriage supper. We'll get invited. We'll sit at the king's table. We're going to sit at the Lord's table. Jesus talked about this, right? Literally, David is acting out, whether he knows this or not, exactly what Jesus will do for us. He'll take dead dogs such as us, who didn't deserve anything, and out of the kindness of his heart will not only lift us, not only not kill us and not send us to eternal doom, will actually bless us, and not only bless us, allow us to sit at his table. It's kind of mind-blowing to think about, but that's what's happening here. Can you see the gospel message all throughout? And let's look at the last two verses here, 12 and 13. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. And you can see there, why do you think it said Mephibosheth had a young son? Well, remember when Mephibosheth broke his legs, or however it happened, got crippled in the feet, he was 5 years old, right? He was 5 years old, and that was when Jonathan Saul died, and now he has a kid. So now we're seeing how long this has been, right? He's had a kid. It has to be at least an infant, right? So we're seeing now he's not a 5-year-old, he's not a 12-year-old anymore. It's not just 7 years since the war. It's now at least a decade or longer probably, right? So we're seeing it. This has gone long enough where he's been in hiding. And then again, this is all symbol. Mephibosheth, I'm just going to recap, is such a great, again, symbol of the gospel because we have all, how did Mephibosheth get hurt? Remember? He fell. Didn't he fall? He broke his legs. We also have fallen in our sin, right? We are lame. We could do nothing on our own without the Lord, right? And we actually don't even deserve his kindness. But God, in his love and kindness, shows us grace, forgives us based on his covenant. Remember, that's why David did this, based on the covenant with Jonathan. So based on his covenant with us, the new covenant that Christ created, the new covenant, God pursues us. He comes, looks for us, and finds us, and then he calls us by name, and then has us sit at his table forever. So you can see this is really God almost acting out through David and Mephibosheth as a play. David as Christ, Mephibosheth as you and I. In our fallen state, crippled, no good, and can't do anything on our own, and God in his grace not only forgives us, but also blesses us and allows us to sit at his table as a friend forever. And that's the end of that chapter, and you can see why I love 2 Samuel 9 so much. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts based on any of that? Yeah, Paul.
Is this Micah related to any other Micah in the Bible?
That's a great question. I don't think so because it's the only time we ever really hear, from what I understand, of his son. But that's a really good question. And that's one of the hardest things about the Bible. It's hard enough to keep the Marys and the Josephs together, right? It's hard enough. When I say Joseph, are we talking about Genesis or are we talking about the New Testament? Mary, which one? Magdalene or the mother of Jesus? Like, you get so confused. So that's a really good thing to look out for. I think this is just a unique Micah, and I think the only reason we ever find out about him again is just it's like a reminder of how long it's been since David has followed up on the death of Jonathan and where his son would be at. But that's a really great question because you always want to fact check those names. Actually, because that Machir of the son of Amiel and Lodabar, he will come back up. We'll actually see him later in the book. So it's really interesting to see some of the names pop back in. Some are just mentioned for these other reasons. So that's a really good question. Any other questions or comments based on any of that? Yeah, Ashley.
Is it safe to assume because David was confidently praying the promises of God and the victory ahead of time, that's why he had the victory in the following chapter?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. It's one of those things, like, what came first? Was it God's promises? Did God establish it and then he just walked in it? Or because he knew this, did his prayers do it? And I think it's one of those symbiotic relationships beyond our understanding that the Lord had always planned this. But I think a lot of it had to do with God saying, hey, I'm going to build your house. It's going to be great. David knows there's going to be great blessing because he was trying to build a temple and God didn't have to do this. So out of this, if God says you're going to dominate and you're going to have a great kingdom, you're not as afraid to pray and go to war and start to conquer these lands. So I think God gave him confidence by his promises. Just like we can have, God promised, all these things to us. We can look at his promises, and it's actually really healthy to pray those promises in your prayers. It'll remind you, when I'm praying for people who are sick or need healing, I'll always pray, Lord, you are the one who created the body. Lord, you promised that you're the healer. You promised that you gave us the power and the Holy Spirit to heal people with your power. You remind these things because God does that, and that will strengthen our faith, which will allow things to happen. Because did you know, it's true, that some of our prayers don't get answered because of us. Not because of God, but because of us and our lack of belief. So that's why these promises, like you just pointed out, these promises are so helpful. I'm sure they helped David to pray and be confident. I'm sure David prayed every day before he went into one of those battles, knowing that the Lord would give him victory. And if he didn't, the Lord would still prosper him and bless him in whatever way that would be. He had faith in the Lord. So that's a great question as well. Anybody else have any questions or comments on any of that? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Go ahead and read ahead. We'll be in chapter 10 next time, Lord willing, and we'll jump into that. But until then, have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next time.